answers are correct. Firstly, Hamas played a very smart game. And secondly, if we weren't successful, it was probably because we weren't good enough. And we can tell now where we were wrong and where we weren't accurate or where we were following the wrong ideas. If I could travel back in time, I believe the outcome would be different.
So let's go to the deal itself. We said on one hand an Israeli soldier alive, and on the other hand, murderers. Let's start with the sentimental issue. I know you don't like to deal about that, but obviously everybody asks, if it was your son or my son, what would we do?
It's not a fair question because you're dragging me back to the emotional side. Any parent will do whatever it takes to bring their child home and make sure they're safe. But that is irrelevant because our duty as members of the security forces is to ignore those emotions and do our job the best way we can. You get exposed to events and dilemmas heavily dominated by emotion, but that cannot affect your decision-making process. Family, friends, activists are motivated by their emotional side, but for us, that just cannot be a factor.
But we were seeing one Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, who said no to this deal because the price was known from the beginning, and then another Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who said yes to the same deal. How come?
And there was another change that I would like to point out. The head of Shin Bet, Yoav Limor, categorically opposed releasing that number of prisoners for his release. His successor, Yoav Limor, changed this position. And so I don't believe that the Prime Minister would make that decision if the head of Shin Bet would oppose it.
Can you explain why Yoav Limor was against such a deal? Because of the release of so many terrorists out there who can do more terror attacks?
Look, I was present at very few work meetings held between the Prime Minister and the head of Shin Bet, and so I cannot say much about what happened there in the closed room between Netanyahu and Yoav Limor.
So let's talk about the deal itself. Israel and Hamas were negotiating for a long time, mainly in Egypt, to create a deal. Amongst the names were a list. We meet Yahya Sinwar, the current leader of Hamas, Salah Harouri, the leader of Hamas terror attacks coming from outside, sitting mainly in Turkey, and many, many others. Was it a price too heavy to pay?
No, it was not.
No.
Explain.
Look, you mentioned Yahya Sinwar and Salah Harouri, but there are others who since were able to kill Israeli citizens, released in the deal, and back to terror. The people behind those terror attacks that were foiled last week in Jenin are what we call the West Bank wing. Those are all people released in the Gilad Shalit deal. Terrorists, murderers, that are free today and are very busy, not volunteering for the homeless, but rather planning more attacks and seeking to kill Israelis. Those are the people we released.
Israel arrested many of them later because they were involved in terror attacks. Hamas is furious about that, right?
כן, יש סוגיה נוספת. יחיא סינואר, אנחנו כל הזמן שוכחים אותו. יחיא סינואר...
And there's another issue here. Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza, he spent most of his adult life in prison, and he runs the Gaza Strip, just like he ran the prisons he spent time in. If you didn't bring him food, we will burn our cells and mattresses. And now he fires missiles if he doesn't get what he wants. The prisoner issue, and we're now in the midst of deliberating yet another prisoner exchange deal with Gaza. I seriously don't see Hamas agreeing to any deal in which those prisoners who are now back in jail are not released. A new term.
Because he was released on the Shalit deal and his friends stayed in prison?
Certainly. How is that going to look if Sinwar, who was himself released in the Shalit deal, give back the captives to Israel for anything less than the deal he was released in? Not a chance.
Israel will not pay such a heavy price for two civilians who are mentally disabled and for two dead soldiers. It's not the same as a human being, a living soldier that the state sent him there and is entitled to bring him back home.
ההבדל בינינו לבין החמאס, לבין לא רק החמאס, ארגונים נוספים, שאנחנו מנסים להבין...
The difference between us and Hamas is that we try to understand them through our logic and our values. We need to see things through their eyes. I believe they understand Israel and the Israeli society very correctly. They understand that the bodies of soldiers killed in battle and the captive civilians are equal in the eyes of the Israeli public. They have precedents, like Elchanan Tenenbaum, a criminal. He was a drug dealer, and Israel paid a heavy price for his release. Samir Kuntal, a cold-blooded murderer, and there are other examples. Hamas understands that Israel sees a dead soldier equal to a live one.
So if you were to manage these negotiations now, what would you do? Because it seems like, those two dead soldiers that we've mentioned, Hadar Goldin and Oron Shaul, were killed in Operation Protective Edge in 2014. It's 7 years now. It seems like Israel did everything, and still we are stuck at the beginning point.
Let me just remind you that the soldiers that were killed in the Sultan Yaqub battle in Syria were brought back to Israel for burial almost 40 years later. The state of Israel will not just let it go. I know the people who are in charge of it today. They're very serious. How can we pressure Hamas? In my opinion, the humanitarian issue. That is the best stick and carrot we have. Gaza is in horrific shape, despite what they're trying to show. We have the support of other states in the area, and that should be our weapon of choice to keep the pressure on Hamas. Honestly, I cannot see any deal that Israel agrees to, maybe with the exception of releasing women and teenagers, that is similar to the one Gilad Shalit was released in.
About 10 or 15 years ago, there was a committee led by a former president of the Israeli Supreme Court, Meir Shamgar, who came out with a final conclusion that you pay one living prisoner for one living soldier, one body for one body. Israel didn't obey that in the Shalit deal. And as you say, looking at Hamas, there is no chance for such deal in the future. And if we say Hamas, we say Hezbollah, it's the same.
The archives of the IDF, the Prime Minister's office, Shin Bet, are full of binders with committee conclusions and recommendations.
So what?
Explain to me why Israel is so sensitive about that. We look around the world, we see the Americans, we see the French, we see other democracies which look at human lives with appreciation. Unlike the Arab world, but still, we look different. All the world look at us and say, you are crazy. You, the Jewish people, lost your mind.
Firstly, that is correct, in all aspects. But seriously, I don't know of any other country out there that sees its soldiers like we do. Those are our children. The army is the army of the people. The US is a whole different story. There is no other country like Israel in the sense of how it perceives its military. And despite the criticism and sarcasm, when we see soldiers in uniform, especially combat soldiers, we fill up with pride. We tear up on Memorial Day, no matter what side you're on politically.
And as you said, Ilan, it's a mandatory service. It's not a professional service, unlike in the UK or the US. It's a mandatory service. We have to go there, so the country has to do everything to bring us back.
That's correct, and every soldier hears this sentence on his first day of the military service. The military is part of our daily lives here. When you meet someone, the second question after asking for their name would be, where did you serve? That is the Israeli mentality. We are still under threat, and the IDF is the people's army after all.
You know, in the past we saw huge deals releasing prisoners. In the big wars, 67, 73, even in 82, Israel paid a very heavy price. But it seems like this weapon of kidnapping became something strategic. Instead of being a tactical weapon, it became a strategic weapon. Hezbollah looks at it as something that will rock Israel. Hamas looks at it. And if you talk to soldiers, we both have sons in that age, the first thing they say to themselves, if I get kidnapped, kill me, so I won't fall alive and be kidnapped by the enemy.
כן, רק בתחילת השאלה,
Yes, but referring to the part of POWs that were captured in the war and taken to Arab countries, that's a completely different story. You're dealing with a state actor. Although people were tortured and sometimes even died in prison, still, it's completely different. Terror organizations see the abduction of a live Israeli soldier as their highest level of strategy, because they understand they can achieve more than any bus explosion. And that's true, although not said out loud, but every soldier who goes into battle says to himself, and it may sound awful, but it's better to die in battle than to be taken alive by Hamas or Hezbollah.
נורא מה שאני אומר. למות מאשר ליפול בשבי החמאס או להבדיל לחיזבאללה. אומרים את זה חיילים וגם מפקדים.
I want to take you, before we end, to the deal itself. Is Hamas stronger thanks to the Shalit deal, or maybe it's weaker because it released Israel to fight Hamas? We saw it in 2014. We saw it this May in the last Operation Guardian of the Walls.
תראה, בימים או בשנים הראשונות לאחר העסקה, אז כמובן...
In the days or in the years following the deal, look, one of the key issues in Palestinian society is prisoners. Hamas were the only ones who were able to release more than 1,000 inmates, and they were at their peak at the time. But on the other side, they set a bar that is very high and they cannot go below in the eyes of their people. Families protesting in Gaza want the same thing. Can Yahya Sinwar say, I will only negotiate to release my friends? Hamas has been in power in Gaza for the past 14 years. That is a long stretch, even more than the Netanyahu government here in Israel. We constantly say that they present a false picture or a false reality. So what? Again, we look at it from our perspective. They say, we release the prisoners, we do not back down, and we keep the struggle alive.
מה זה משנה? שוב, אנחנו מסתכלים בעיניים שלנו. הוא הציג שחררנו אסירים, אנחנו לא מוותרים, אנחנו ממשיכים בלוחמה הפסיכולוגית.
So last question, you served in the Southern Command of the Shabak for most of your service, and you know Gaza very well, and you know Hamas very well. Is there a chance to have better life, better situation with Hamas and Gaza, or are we doomed to stay in the same situation?
For us or the people of Gaza?
For both sides.
תראה,
Look, there are over 2 million people living in Gaza on a 365 square kilometers of land. Let's skip forward 10 or 20 years. Forget the military side for a minute. Demographics. Population grows by 1 million every 20 years. So there will be 3 million people on the same piece of land in 20 years' time. It's like a pressure cooker. If there will not be active involvement of Egypt and other state actors, Israel will certainly keep fighting in Gaza for many years to come.
אין לי ספק בכלל.